At exactly 2:07 a.m. on a cold Tuesday night in November, I received a text message that made my blood run cold. It was from my husband Tom's phone, and the message was crystal clear. Don't sign anything. Trust no one. I love you. The problem? Tom had been dead for 3 weeks, and his phone had supposedly been destroyed in the car accident that killed him. My name is Rachel Johnson, and I'm 42 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I was living a perfectly ordinary life in Austin, Texas, as a former elementary school teacher turned stay-at-home wife. My husband Tom was 44 and owned Johnson Construction, a successful building company he'd started with his best friend and business partner, Steve Miller. We'd been married for 18 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about the man I loved. Tom died on October 28th in what everyone called a tragic accident. He was driving home late from a job site inspection when his truck went off Highway 183 and crashed into a creek. The police said he'd fallen asleep at the wheel after working a 16-hour day. The truck was completely submerged, and by the time emergency responders pulled him out, it was too late. The impact had been so severe that his phone, his wallet, and most of his personal belongings were either destroyed or lost in the murky water. I'd been struggling to cope with the sudden loss of my husband while dealing with an avalanche of paperwork, insurance claims, and business decisions I'd never had to make before. Tom had always handled our finances and his construction business, leaving me to focus on our home and the substitute teaching I did occasionally. Suddenly, I was drowning in legal documents, insurance forms, and business contracts that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Steve Miller, Tom's business partner for over 15 years, had been incredibly supportive during this difficult time. He'd handled Tom's funeral arrangements, dealt with the company's immediate needs, and even helped me understand some of the financial paperwork that kept arriving in the mail. Steve and his wife Nancy had been our closest friends for years, and I was grateful to have someone I could trust helping me navigate this nightmare. But that text message at 2 a.m. changed everything. I sat up in bed, staring at my phone screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence of my empty house. The message was definitely from Tom's number. I'd been staring at it in my contacts for weeks, unable to bring myself to delete it. I'd even called the number several times just to hear his voicemail greeting, desperately missing the sound of his voice. My first instinct was to assume someone had found Tom's phone and was playing a cruel joke. But who would be heartless enough to do such a thing? And how would they even know about the documents I'd been dealing with? I hadn't told anyone outside of Steve and my attorney Susan Taylor about the specific paperwork I was reviewing. I tried calling the number immediately, but it went straight to voicemail, Tom's voicemail, with his familiar voice saying, "You've reached Tom Johnson. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Hearing his voice at 2 a.m. 3 weeks after his death sent chills through my entire body. I barely slept for the rest of the night, staring at that message and trying to make sense of what had happened. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a dream or some kind of technical glitch, but the message was still there on my phone, impossible to explain and impossible to ignore. The past 3 weeks since Tom's death had been the most difficult period of my life. Our house in the West Lake Hills neighborhood of Austin felt enormous and empty without Tom's presence. Every morning, I'd wake up expecting to hear him in the shower or smell the coffee he always made before leaving for work. Instead, I'd find myself alone with a pile of documents that seemed to grow larger every day. Tom and I had met in college at the University of Texas, where he was studying engineering, and I was working toward my teaching degree. We'd built what I thought was a transparent, Loving marriage based on trust and open communication. Tom handled our finances and his business, but he'd always kept me informed about major decisions. He'd built Johnson Construction from nothing into one of Austin's most respected residential building companies, specializing in custom homes for affluent clients. His partnership with Steve Miller had been the foundation of the company's success. Steve handled the business side, contracts, client relationships, and financial planning, while Tom focused on the construction management and quality control. They'd been best friends since high school, and their wives, Nancy and I, had become close over the years, often traveling together and hosting dinner parties at each other's homes. After Tom's accident, Steve had stepped up in ways that made me incredibly grateful to have him in my life. He'd handled all the immediate business decisions, managed the construction crews, and even helped me understand Tom's life insurance policies. The insurance payout was substantial, $2 million, which would allow me to maintain our lifestyle and potentially keep Tom's share of the business. But the paperwork was overwhelming. There were insurance forms, business partnership documents, tax filings, and estate planning papers that required my signature. Susan Taylor, our family attorney, had been helpful, but she was juggling multiple cases and couldn't walk me through every single document. Steve had offered to explain the business-related paperwork, which seemed logical since he understood the company's operations better than anyone. The most pressing issue was a set of documents that would transfer Tom's 50% ownership stake in Johnson Construction to Steve, with me receiving a cash settlement equal to the business's appraised value. Steve explained that this would be simpler than trying to manage a construction business I didn't understand, and the money would give me financial security without the stress of business ownership. My mother-in-law, Mary, had been staying with me for the first 2 weeks after Tom's death, helping with practical matters and providing emotional support. But she'd returned to Dallas the week before, leaving me alone to deal with the endless stream of decisions and paperwork. My best friend and neighbor, Kate Davis, checked on me daily, bringing meals and offering shoulders to cry on. But even she couldn't help me make sense of the business and legal matters I was facing. The night I received that text message, I'd been reviewing the ownership transfer documents that Steve wanted me to sign. The paperwork was complex, filled with legal terminology and financial projections that made my head spin. Steve had assured me that the transaction was fair and that Tom would have wanted me to be free from business responsibilities during my grief. I'd been teaching 3rd grade at Westlake Elementary before Tom's business became successful enough for me to stay home. I'd always been good with details and organization, but business law and construction industry finances were completely outside my area of expertise. I relied heavily on Steve's guidance and Susan Taylor's legal advice, trusting that they had my best interests at heart. Looking back, I realize how isolated I'd become in the weeks following Tom's death. I'd stopped returning calls from some of our friends, avoided social gatherings, and focused entirely on managing the practical aspects of widowhood. This isolation made me more dependent on Steve's help and less likely to seek second opinions about the decisions I was making. The text message that arrived at 2 a.m. shattered the fragile sense of stability I'd been building. Someone or something was warning me not to sign documents, and the timing felt too specific to be coincidental. The morning after receiving that first text message, I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of technical error or cruel prank. But when Steve called around 9 a.m. to schedule a meeting about finalizing the business transfer documents, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather in Austin. "Rachel, I know this is difficult timing," Steve said, his voice carrying the same sympathetic tone he'd used for weeks. "But we really need to get these ownership papers signed soon. The business is in limbo, and our clients are starting to ask questions about leadership and project continuity. Something in his urgency felt different this time. For 3 weeks, Steve had been patient and understanding about the pace of our legal proceedings. Suddenly, he seemed anxious to expedite everything, particularly the documents that would transfer Tom's ownership stake to him. I told Steve about the text message, expecting him to be as confused and concerned as I was. Instead, his reaction was dismissive and almost irritated. "Rachel, you're grieving and under enormous stress," he said. "Phone companies sometimes have glitches that send old messages, or maybe someone found Tom's phone and is playing a sick joke. You can't let something like this derail important business decisions." But that afternoon, I received another message from Tom's number. "Check the safe. Look behind the tax files. Steve is lying." This time, I screenshotted the message immediately and called my attorney, Susan Taylor. Like Steve, she seemed skeptical about the source of the texts, but agreed that I shouldn't sign any major documents until we could investigate further. That evening, I went to Tom's home office and opened the safe he'd installed behind a painting of the Austin skyline. Tom had given me the combination years earlier for emergencies, though I'd rarely needed to access it. Behind the files containing our tax returns, I found a manila envelope I'd never seen before. Inside were copies of emails, financial records, and what appeared to be evidence of irregularities in Johnson Construction's accounts. The documents suggested that Steve had been systematically overcharging clients and skimming money from project budgets. There were emails between Steve and subcontractors discussing inflated invoices, records of payments to shell companies that didn't seem to provide any actual services, and a handwritten note from Tom indicating he'd discovered financial discrepancies totaling nearly $400,000. The most chilling discovery was a series of emails Tom had sent to himself, apparently as a way to document his investigation. The final email, dated just 2 days before his death, read, "Steve knows I'm onto him. He's been asking about my life insurance and suggesting I'm working too hard. I need to be careful. If anything happens to me, Rachel needs to know the truth." The next morning, I received a third text. "Don't trust the police report. Accident was staged. Brakes were cut." My hands were shaking as I read it. Tom had always been a careful driver, especially late at night. The idea that his accident might have been deliberately caused was horrifying, but it suddenly explained Steve's eagerness to settle the business matters quickly. When Steve arrived for our scheduled meeting that afternoon, I noticed details about his behavior that I'd missed before. He seemed nervous, constantly checking his watch and asking if I'd made decisions about signing the ownership transfer. When I mentioned finding some of Tom's old business files, Steve's entire demeanor changed. "You shouldn't be going through Tom's work documents without me there to explain them," he said, his friendly tone becoming sharp and controlling. Tom kept detailed records, but they can be misleading if you don't understand the context of our industry. Why don't you let me take those files and organize them properly? I refused to hand over the documents, claiming I wanted to understand Tom's business better before making any major decisions. Steve's facade of patient friendship began to crack. "Rachel, you're being paranoid and irrational," he said. "I've been trying to help you through this difficult time, but you're making it impossible. These delays are hurting the business and your financial future." That night, I called my friend Kate and asked her to stay over. I didn't feel safe alone in the house, and I needed someone I could trust while I figured out what to do with the information I'd discovered. Kate was shocked by the text messages and the documents from Tom's safe, but she agreed that something wasn't right about Steve's behavior. The final text arrived at 11:47 p.m., Call Detective Laura Smith. Evidence hidden in office basement. I love you forever. The morning after receiving the final text message, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to live in fear and confusion, I was going to take action. And the text had mentioned Detective Laura Smith specifically, which seemed too detailed to be random. I called the Austin Police Department and asked to speak with her directly. Detective Smith was initially skeptical when I explained the situation over the phone. Mrs. Johnson, I understand you're grieving, but text messages from deceased individuals are usually the result of delayed delivery systems or someone with access to the victim's accounts, she said professionally. However, if you believe you have evidence of financial crimes related to your husband's business, I'd be willing to review what you've found. I drove to the police station that afternoon with copies of everything I'd discovered in Tom's safe. Detective Smith was a woman in her 40s, with kind but sharp eyes, who listened carefully as I explained the timeline of events. When I showed her Tom's documented investigation into Steve's financial irregularities, her demeanor became more serious. Mrs. Johnson, these documents suggest significant financial fraud, she said, studying the papers carefully. If your husband was investigating his business partner and had evidence of embezzlement that could potentially provide motive for more serious crimes, I asked Detective Smith to investigate Tom's accident more thoroughly. She explained that while the case had been closed as an accidental death, the mention of tampered brakes in the text message was specific enough to warrant a second look at the physical evidence from the crash site. That evening, I made another crucial decision. I called Dan Brown, Tom's loyal foreman who'd been with the company for 8 years. Dan had always been completely honest with Tom and had worked closely with him on job site management. If anyone would know about irregularities in the business operations, it would be Dan. Mrs. Johnson, I'm so glad you called, Dan said when I reached him. I've been wanting to talk to someone about some things that have been bothering me, but I wasn't sure who to trust. Dan explained that he'd noticed Steve making unusual decisions about subcontractors and suppliers in recent months, often choosing more expensive options without consulting Tom. Tom was asking me a lot of questions about invoices and project costs in the weeks before he died, Dan continued. He seemed worried about something but didn't want to discuss details. Steve told me after the funeral that I shouldn't bother you with business concerns, but honestly, some of the financial decisions he's been making don't make sense. I arranged to meet Dan the next day at the Johnson Construction office. The building was a converted warehouse in East Austin that housed the company's administrative offices, equipment storage, and a basement area where Tom kept archived project files and old equipment. Steve typically worked from the main office upstairs, while Tom had preferred spending time in the basement workspace, where he could review blueprints and plan projects. When Dan and I arrived at the office, I used Tom's keys to access areas that Steve probably assumed I'd never visit. In the basement, behind a filing cabinet that required both of us to move, we found a hidden metal box that Tom had apparently installed without Steve's knowledge. Inside the box was a laptop computer, external hard drives, and a folder containing financial records that painted a clear picture of Steve's embezzlement scheme. Tom had been methodically documenting evidence for months, building a case that would have sent Steve to prison for financial fraud and theft. The laptop contained email correspondence between Tom and a forensic accountant he'd hired secretly to audit the company's finances. The investigation had revealed that Steve had stolen nearly $600,000 over the past 2 years through various schemes involving fake vendors, inflated invoices, and diverted payments. Most importantly, I found a video message that Tom had recorded just 3 days before his death. In the video, Tom explained everything he'd discovered about Steve's criminal activities and his plan to confront his business partner and turn the evidence over to authorities. "If you're watching this, Rachel, something has happened to me," Tom said in the video, looking directly into the camera with the serious expression I knew so well. "Steve Miller has been stealing from our company and our clients. I have evidence that will put him in prison, but I'm afraid he might try to stop me before I can go to the police. I need you to know that I love you, and if anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Dan and I immediately called Detective Smith and arranged to turn over all the evidence we'd discovered. That night, I finally understood that the text messages, whether from some delayed phone system or divine intervention, had led me to the truth about Tom's death and Steve's crimes. The man I'd trusted to help me through my grief had actually murdered my husband and was trying to steal everything Tom had worked to build. Detective Smith moved quickly once she reviewed the evidence Dan and I had discovered in Tom's hidden basement office. Within 24 hours, she'd obtained warrants to examine Tom's truck more thoroughly and to investigate Steve's financial records. What they found confirmed our worst fears and revealed the full scope of Steve's betrayal. The forensic examination of Tom's truck, which had been stored in a police impound lot, revealed evidence that the brake lines had been deliberately severed. The cuts were clean and precise, made with a sharp tool rather than damaged by the impact of the accident. Additionally, investigators found traces of metal filings near the brake system that suggested the sabotage had been done recently, probably on the day of Tom's death. Steve's financial records revealed an even more elaborate criminal scheme than Tom had uncovered. Beyond the embezzlement from Johnson Construction, Steve had been forging Tom's signature on loan applications, using the company as collateral for personal investments that had failed catastrophically. Steve owed nearly $800,000 to various creditors and faced financial ruin if his crimes were discovered. The breakthrough came when Detective Smith discovered that Steve had purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on Tom just 6 months before his death, naming himself as the beneficiary for business protection purposes. Tom had never been told about this policy, and his signature on the application was clearly forged. When confronted with the evidence, Steve's wife, Nancy, revealed that she'd been suspicious of her husband's behavior for months. Steve had been working unusual hours, making secretive phone calls, and had suddenly become obsessed with Tom's work schedule and daily routines. Nancy had assumed he was having an affair, but the reality was far more sinister. The final piece of the puzzle came from security camera footage that police obtained from a business near the construction company's office. The footage showed Steve's car following Tom's truck on the evening of October 28th, the night Tom died. Steve had claimed to be at home with Nancy that evening, but the timestamp on the security video proved he'd been lying. Detective Smith arranged for Steve to be arrested at his home early on a Friday morning. I watched from my kitchen window as police cars surrounded the Miller house 3 blocks away from mine. Steve was charged with first-degree murder, insurance fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. During Steve's interrogation, which Detective Smith allowed me to observe from behind one-way glass, the truth about that terrible night finally came out. Steve had sabotaged Tom's truck earlier that day while it was parked at a remote job site. He then followed Tom as he drove home, ensuring that the brake failure would occur on the dangerous curve where Highway 183 crosses Barton Creek. Tom was going to destroy everything I'd worked for, Steve said during his confession, showing no remorse for murdering his supposed best friend. He was too honest, too rigid about following rules. He would have sent me to prison, and ruined my family's life over some accounting discrepancies. The most chilling revelation was Steve's plan to manipulate me into signing over Tom's business shares while collecting on the Secret Life insurance policy. He'd calculated that with Tom dead, he could gain control of the entire company, collect $2 million in insurance money, and eliminate the only person who knew about his embezzlement. Rachel trusted me completely, Steve continued in his confession. She relied on my advice about everything business-related. If those text messages hadn't spooked her, she would have signed everything within another week. I would have owned the entire company and had enough money to cover my debts. When Detective Smith asked Steve about Tom's phone and the mysterious text messages I'd received, his reaction was complete bewilderment. Steve insisted he had no idea how the messages had been sent, claiming Tom's phone had been destroyed in the accident, just as police had originally reported. "There's no way those messages came from Tom's phone," Steve said, becoming agitated for the first time during his interrogation. "I saw the phone after the accident. It was completely smashed. Even if it wasn't destroyed, I never had access to it, and Tom never suspected me enough to set up any kind of automated messaging system." The technical investigation into the text messages remained inconclusive. Phone company records showed the messages had definitely been sent from Tom's number, but there was no evidence of delayed delivery, automated systems, or third-party access to his account. The messages appeared to have been sent in real time from a phone that should no longer have existed. Whether those messages came from a divine intervention, a technical glitch that defied explanation, or some other mysterious source, they had saved my life and brought justice for Tom's murder. Without that first warning at 2 a.m., I would have signed away everything Tom had worked for and never discovered the truth about his death. Steve Miller was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The forensic evidence, his confession, and Tom's hidden documentation created an airtight case that left no doubt about his guilt. Nancy divorced him immediately and moved back to her family in Dallas, devastated by the discovery that her husband had been living a double life as both an embezzler and a murderer. The financial recovery process was complex, but ultimately successful. With Steve's conviction, all of his fraudulent transactions were reversed, and I was able to recover most of the money he'd stolen from Johnson Construction. The forged life insurance policy was invalidated, but Tom's legitimate life insurance provided the financial security he'd always wanted me to have. I decided to sell Johnson Construction to Dan Brown, Tom's loyal foreman who had helped me uncover the truth. Dan had the experience and integrity to continue Tom's legacy of quality construction and honest business practices. The sale provided me with enough money to live comfortably while honoring the company Tom had built with his own hands. The mystery of the text messages was never solved. Phone company technicians, police investigators, and even computer experts I hired privately could find no explanation for how those messages had been sent from Tom's destroyed phone. The messages had appeared to be sent in real time, with perfect timing and specific information that saved my life and exposed Steve's crimes. Some people suggested the messages were delayed transmissions from before Tom's death, but the content was too specific to current events for that explanation to make sense. Others theorized about technical glitches or hacking, but no evidence supported those theories either. My mother-in-law, Mary, became convinced that Tom had somehow communicated with me from beyond death to protect me from Steve's evil plans. I learned to live with the mystery while being profoundly grateful for whatever force had warned me in time. Those text messages had not only saved me from financial ruin, but it also ensured that Tom's killer faced justice for his crimes. Without that first warning, Steve would have succeeded in his plan to murder my husband and steal everything we'd built together. The experience taught me important lessons about trust and intuition. I'd been so focused on grieving Tom's loss that I'd failed to notice Steve's suspicious behavior and urgent timeline for finalizing business matters. In the future, I would never again make major financial decisions without seeking multiple professional opinions and taking time to thoroughly understand every document I signed. 6 months after Steve's conviction, I established the Tom Johnson Memorial Foundation, which provides financial assistance to families of crime victims and supports programs that help people recognize and report financial fraud. The foundation was funded with part of the money recovered from Steve's criminal activities, turning his theft into something that could help other families avoid similar tragedies. I still live in our Austin home, though I've renovated Tom's office into a library and reading room that feels more peaceful than the workspace where he'd spent his final weeks investigating his business partner's betrayal. I've returned to substitute teaching and volunteer work, finding purpose in helping others while honoring Tom's memory. The text messages stopped after Steve's arrest, as suddenly and mysteriously as they'd begun. Tom's phone number was eventually reassigned by the phone company, but I'd saved screenshots of every message he'd sent me during those crucial days when his warnings had guided me to the truth. Sometimes I still wonder about the source of those messages and whether Tom somehow found a way to protect me after death. What I know for certain is that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms into something that can still offer guidance, protection, and hope when we need it most. Tom's final message to me had been, "I love you forever," and through those mysterious text messages, he'd proven that some promises transcend even death itself.